I did want to linger on domestic politics for a moment. And of course, in particular, in that montage that we just watched of Trump clips, before he started sharing his general thoughts about how it's fucked up that babies are born in the ninth month, he was taking credit for the Supreme Court's decision to reverse Roe v. Wade in the Dobbs decision, which has had the effect of stripping women of the right to abortion in several states around the country, and is just one of many fun decisions that has been made by the increasingly conservative Supreme Court in the last couple of years. One that might be coming down the pipe. It's not at the level of the Supreme Court yet, but one to watch is the one that I was writing about last week for Compact. So the article there, I think we have the graphic, is called Big Business's War on the New Deal. And this is about there's a lawsuit by SpaceX, which is, of course, one of Elon Musk's ventures, in which the SpaceX attorneys argue that the very existence of the National Labor Relations Board is essentially unconstitutional, and that the court should get rid of it. And this is an argument that's made. That's the case in federal courts that's made it, but it's also been made at the level of the NLRB's own administrative courts by Trader Joe's and Amazon. They've both made this argument that the NLRB is unconstitutional, as well as SpaceX. If this happens, this is going to be arguably the highest point of the 50-year counter-revolution. They argue that essentially the problem with the NLRB is that it both sort of makes complaints in this sort of prosecutorial like way, and also renders binding judgments, or different parts of it do. And so this is like combining different powers in ways that shouldn't be allowed, or they think are unconstitutional. So in the SpaceX legal filing, they have a quote, which I think we also have a graphic for, from James Madison. They say the NLRB's current way of functioning is miles away from the traditional understanding of the separation of powers, which views, quote, the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands as the very definition of tyranny, which comes from the Federalist Papers, number 47, James Madison. Would you guys believe that Elon Musk's lawyers didn't read the Federalist Papers very carefully when they pulled out that quote?
Yeah, I would believe it based on how he's running a lot of his businesses lately, and how how embarrassing some lawyers can be. So what did they miss, Ben?
Yeah. So I actually did, I'm a ridiculous enough nerd that when I was reading this to write the article, I actually went and read Federalist 47.
What a chump! What a chump you are reading the material.
And look, I don't know what James Madison would have thought about the structure of modern labor law. I do know that he owned a bunch of slaves. So he might very well have been on Elon Musk's side of this one, but he also thought of the abstract slavery was wrong, but that didn't stop him. In any case, I guess Madison was like the slavery equivalent of look, I know factory farming is bad, but I just like these burgers too much. In any case, I suppose if you did go back in time to ask Madison what you thought, first you'd have to explain the 100 years of American history that happened between his death and the National Labor Relations Act, and it would probably be a long conversation. But I will say in Federalist 47, he's making almost exactly the opposite of the point that Elon Musk's lawyers are making. What he was doing is he's summarizing an objection that was made to the Constitution by anti-federalists who are saying, no, the U.S. Constitution is bad because it allows overlap between these different spheres, the executive, legislative, and judicial. He's like, okay, if it concentrated all power in all of them in these hands, I agree that would be bad. That'd be the very definition of tyranny, but it really doesn't. The overlap is more limited, and some overlap, he argues very explicitly in Federalist 47, some overlap is fine. And so certainly you think about how the NLRB works. Does it concentrate all power, executive, legislative, and judicial, in the same hands? Well, not really. I mean, it's the actual members of the board are appointed by the president, so they're not. It's not like they appoint their own successors. The institution is created by law and could be done away with by other laws by Congress. In fact, not only does it not concentrate all judicial power, but fun fact, as I'm sure Jake is very aware from his other his non-GTAA activities as a union organizer, the NLRB doesn't even have the power to issue fines, right? They literally can't even do that. They can, like, if you're illegally fired for union activity, they can order the company to reinstate you, and they can order the company to give you back pay, but like they can't but they can't even assess financial penalties beyond that. And of course, NLRB decisions, once they're made, the rulings can then be reversed in federal courts, and sometimes are.
Yeah. Do you have a sense of how likely this would be to eventually go through? I've seen it kind of on the radar, but I was trying to ostrich this information because it would be too terrible.
Yeah, it's relatively early phases still, but it is in federal court. It does seem like the kind of thing that I think the Supreme Court majority might enjoy ruling on. So I could see it happening. And of course, what they really want is that, if you are, essentially this is a bid to knock out the last few remaining teeth in American labor law, by if SpaceX and Amazon and Trader Joe got their way, then you would have to, if you were like illegally fired for union activity, to get your job back, you would have to wait for there to literally be a federal case, right? That like you'd have to wait for the federal courts, which could take years to happen. And by the time it happened, even if you won your case, I think the point would be effectively made to any of your coworkers who are thinking about, following your example.
So there would still be labor laws in place in the sense of like you could legally form a union and stuff like that. It's been a few years since I've really. So the biggest thing you're thinking or is the regulatory aspect of, hey, don't fire somebody for union activity, because like that one check you're saying would basically be get drawn out over such a long period of time that like all of the regulatory functions NLRB can do with a little bit of speed at this point would just completely go moot and give some like way more power to the companies, is what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. Like the sort of fundamental, like labor laws would theoretically be about what they are. It's just that they wouldn't really be enforced, even to the extent that they are right now. So yeah, that seems like it would be really bad to me. The sort of basic argument they're making that it's like, oh, this is bad because they, have their own administrative courts and they can issue rulings until the federal courts reverse them, is an argument you could make against literally any regulatory agency. So the implications are already also really bad. Like, could you have an EPA on this argument? It's not clear to me. And yeah, I mean, the whole sort of thing is really grotesque because, at the end of the day, right, like, if you read like the SpaceX filing, or you read like the Federalist Society has some stuff you can find on their website where they're like backing up the argument, all this, it really is this very topsy-turvy view of the world where, Elon Musk, who owns SpaceX, Jeff Bezos, who owns Amazon, and the third one, Trader Joe's, is owned by the Albrecht family, who, granted, are peasants compared to the other two. So Elon and Bezos both have net worths that are hovering around $200 billion. The Albrecht family altogether only have about $54 billion. Although to put that into perspective, if you're a middle-class professional who earns $100,000 a year, it would take you 10,000 years to earn $1 billion. So, so if you think about this, that's the, 540,000 years it would take you to get that Albrecht family net worth. It's still, I think these people are still, doing okay. And, they're in this position where they're basically portraying themselves as like hapless peasants being tyrannized by the NLRB as they're fighting for their fundamental freedom to fire cashiers and warehouse workers without, like in violation of the law, without being caught very soon. All of which is to say that this is, I think those two cases, the one that already happened, overturning Roe v. Wade, and the one that might be on the horizon, within the next couple of years, possibly overturning key sections of the National Labor Relations Act and sort of knocking the legs out of the, one of the cornerstones of the New Deal. I think both give you some sense of what the stake is with left critiques of the legitimacy of the Supreme Court, which sets up the one segment I want to do before we bring on Gene, which is that last week I was a guest on Dan Abrams' show on News Nation. That was the same show I went on after Kissinger died to argue with the guy from the American Conservative. In this case, Abrams, I think I can say this. Basically, what his producer told me is he wanted to, he has a very, this is me, right? This is not what the producer said, but, he has very centristy branding, and the producer said they were looking for a leftist to come argue with them about the legitimacy of the Supreme Court. And since I'd written some articles in Jacobin in the past where I say the Supreme Court has way too much power, etc., and I'd been on for the Kissinger thing, they thought of me. And so, yeah, it was fine. I mean, we'll talk about it a little bit more when we watch it, but it's, the sort of most surreal aspect of it for me is that the segment just before mine, the guest was Geraldo Rivera. So that was, it's like, oh, hey, that's weird.
You made it big. You made it big.
Did you hit him with a chair?
That's what you're supposed to do. Yeah. I was on Zoom, but I still managed to, I paid somebody where he was to hit him with a chair.
Okay. It's totally part of it.
Yeah, exactly. Just it's what you're, it's, I just want him to know that I know and respect his body of work. Right? All right. So let's watch the first part of News Nation.
Now it's Ben Burgis, a progressive commentator and host of the show Give Them an Argument. Thanks so much for coming back on the show. Appreciate it. All right, so what am I getting wrong here?
Thanks so much for having me, Dan. So to my mind, one thing you're getting right is when you say that the central question is not whether we agree or disagree with the rulings. I would say that the central question is who should get to decide. When we're talking not about like financial penalties for individuals like the cases that you mentioned, but core policy issues that matter for our entire society, like whether women have a right to choose nationally, whether we're going to chip away at labor unions' rights to strike, which is what a Supreme Court decision last year did, whether we're going to have like meaningful anti-corruption laws. The Supreme Court's going to make that impossible. The question should be, yeah. Well, I was just going to say the question should be: is this something we should decide democratically, which is how most liberal democracies, like Canada or the UK, for example, work, or should we invest all this power in this elite institution?
All right, so that's a disagreement that you have about. A, I guess the structural issues, but B, the cases that the court has agreed to take and hear. Do you then agree with me that these claims of the illegitimacy of the court are just very bad for the country as a whole?
I don't. I think that it's bad for the country as a whole if we don't get to democratically decide these things. If instead, You have 9 people who are almost always graduates of Harvard or Yale, appointed for life, getting to act as a super legislature, overturning democratically decided public policy. I mean, like, just one quick point about this: read the dissents in any of these major cases. Not oh, Marjorie Taylor Greene got some fines and they upheld it, but cases that actually decide important policy issues for the entire country. These are obviously things, oftentimes they're party line votes. The conservatives all vote one way, the liberals all vote the other way. Any decent constitutional lawyer can make an argument on either side of that. So I think the idea that this is a sort of body that floats above politics just doesn't really make sense. Yeah. So I should say the opening monologue before he brought me on, he was talking about, the Supreme Court doesn't always do the right wing thing. Marjorie Taylor Greene got a fine for not wearing a mask in Congress when House rules said she had to, and the Supreme Court upheld the fine. So there you go. And it's like, yeah, okay. But I'm like really slightly less interested in whether Marjorie Taylor Greene has to pay a fine than I am in like whether the right to abortion exists in all 50 states or, whether we can have labor unions.
And I assume, obviously, this is the point of what he's saying. But even if if the Supreme Court was, ruling in favor of pro-choice and in favor of labor, still theoretically, right? It's not extremely democratic, right? Even if it was ruling in ways that we might like.
Yeah, totally. I mean, look, I would obviously, if we're going to have a Supreme Court, I would rather have that Supreme Court uphold important rights than not. Right. But I also think that it's really important to recognize, because most people don't. Right. It's like, what's the old joke about how God invented war to teach Americans about other countries? Right. That I think most people who have this discussion are really myopic about how unusual the American system is in this respect. Right. Like, most liberal democracies do not give their high court anything like this much power to decide public policy. And so, people will sort of paint this picture. It's like, oh, you don't think the Supreme Court should have this much power to overturn laws that, but then wouldn't we just turn into like a dictatorship, or we wouldn't have free speech anymore or whatever? It's like, I don't know. The high court doesn't have that kind of power in Canada, right? I think the Canadians are okay. Right? Like it's not 1984 up there. I've been to Canada many times.
No, look, that I agree. Look, I get it. And I'm not going to say, oh, the court just decides things based on the law. There's no such thing, right? Everyone has their bias. And in particular, I think that the courts in general have allowed their personal views, right, to come into play in assessing. But I want to keep coming back to what I view as the most important issue here, right? Is this claim of illegitimacy, meaning it scares the heck out of me when people on either side, when I hear the governor of Oklahoma say that you can reject the Supreme Court opinion, when I hear AOC talk about the illegitimacy of the court, it scares me because we need somebody to be the decider in the end, because there are going to be some difficult issues, I think, that are going to be coming up in the years to come. And even maybe in the months to come, maybe over this election, who knows? But whether we agree with them or not, we need someone to make those decisions. And I think these justices have shown that even though it's a very conservative court, they're not just going to make decisions purely based on partisan motives.
Well, I don't think they're necessarily going to make decisions based on purely partisan motives in individual cases like the ones involving Marjorie Taylor Greene or the Trump lawyers, where there are less controversial legal principles at stake. But I do think that they're going to make political decisions when it comes to these giant questions with society-wide implications, like should women have a right to choose? Like, should we uphold, the structure of labor laws that's existed since the 1930s that the right is trying to undermine right now? And I think when you have a court that has been on a tear on those kinds of questions of aggressively imposing, right-wing policy preferences, then I think it makes a lot of sense that that you have this sense of illegitimacy, this sense of, hey, wait a second, on questions like that, shouldn't we all democratically be the final deciders?
Here's what I appreciate about what you're doing, right? You are not doing what I hear others do, which infuriates me so much, which is to just say that the court is illegitimate. You are criticizing the way that you disagree with how the court does what it does. And everyone is entitled to their opinion on that. Ben Burgis, thank you very much for coming on the show. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, that last part kept making me think about the Simpsons episode where they visit Australia and Marge tries to order coffee. And they say, "Oh, beer?" She says, "No, coffee." "Yeah, beer." "Oh, no, coffee, beer." Right? Like I don't know how much clearer I could be than I was. That I think that the kind of power we give to the Supreme Court is illegitimate.
Yeah, I think he definitely did it. Grok, intentionally or unintentionally, what you're putting down. I do think he's conflating two issues. Let me know if what you think. Sure. One is illegitimacy of the court, as in the court has ruled something and I'm going to disagree with it. Like I'm literally not going to follow it. Versus like, should the Supreme Court like have this much power? Should we, maybe democratically dismantle some of those powers? I just think those are two separate issues. And what he was saying is basically that he thinks that like we're going to need the Supreme Court in order to like make sure that democracy continues, and he's worried about like individual states not going along with like the results of the election or something like that. Which is, again, I think you might agree with like, oh, certain laws are so terrible that maybe no one should follow them. But I just think those are two separate. He was kind of scaremongering about like a lawless society, which is not even technically what you were saying. You weren't opining on whether we should follow those laws or not once in the current state that they're in. You know what I mean? That seems to be
literally, I just want to have the kind of balance of power between courts and elected bodies that they have in like Canada, right? Like this is, or again, the vast majority of liberal democracies where like maybe sometimes you have what they call weak judicial review, which means that that the courts, sort of look at the constitutional questions and then throw it back to Parliament or whatever. And, but they don't necessarily have the final say, right? Like, I think that the sort of degree of power that we give our high court of the U.S. is extremely unusual by global standards. And, I think it does operate as something of a, it's like the Islamic Guardianship Council in Iran, right? This is like the Capitalism Guardianship Council, right? That you that if the interests of the powerful are being meddled with too much, you can always get them to rule against it. But yeah, no, I agree with your point, right? Like, in fact, in where he was talking about the Oklahoma guy saying, blustering about like disobeying Supreme Court decisions, which we'll see if he actually does that, but like when he's talking about that, and he's talking about AOC, he's equating two wildly different things, right? The stuff that like AOC was saying is like, yeah, like she maybe wants reforms that would sort of push back against the degree of power that's exercised by the Supreme Court, like maybe expanding the number of justices or having term limits. But that's a completely different thing from like, oh, if the court rules the wrong way about some Trump thing, we're just gonna, I don't know, take to the streets and, like overthrow the government or whatever that, whatever that
maybe
he was going to do. Which is like, I don't know, man. I think the total number of people in the country who are actually prepared to do that is pretty low from what I can tell. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.